Hello, everybody, and welcome to the most recent edition of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society webinar series. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Jamie Hood and Zack Watson, who will be speaking about their game, Thor's Hammer, an operational logistics-focused game based on Norway. Side note, they were both former students with the Georgetown University Basics of Wargaming class that was taught, I think, 2021. And they're going to be speaking about their design process and a variety of their perspectives as students. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie and Zack.
Howdy, everybody. My name is Jamie Hood. We have Zack Watson here. We're two of the co-creators of Thor's Hammer. Sadly, John Abshire is busy serving our nation at the Command and General Staff College, hanging out with Doc Starrett and Mike Dunn all the time, but he is the third of our trio, so he's with us in spirit. And it's nice to see some of y'all in the participants list that helped us out this process. Doc Starrett and Mike Dunn, you're the reason why we spent a bunch of money buying Root and Hanabi, so thank you for that in advance. So without further ado, we're going to talk to you a little bit today about Thor's Hammer, what the game was all about, our design process, what we learned as junior wargamers and first-time wargamers going through this, and then we'll open it up to plenty of questions that feel free to throw in the chat at any time. There'll be opportunities to stop during and after. So the agenda, first we're going to talk about the game. This is going to be a brief overview, very similar to the kind of overview that we give before we demo it. This is, mostly just to give context for the rest of the presentation. We'll refer back to this and get more into the game design mechanics as we go through, but this is just to sort of wet your whistle on what we're going to be talking about. After that, we're going to go into the design process, what we learned and some mistakes we made, followed by some lessons learned to hopefully, even though we're still junior and amateur wargamers, help other people that are listening to this not make quite the same mistakes that we did, and then we'll open it to a general Q&A, and there'll be opportunities to ask questions in between. So immediately abandoning our agenda, we're going to start with speaker bios. So Zack, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jamie, for the introduction. I'm Zack Watson. I just graduated in May of 2022, actually a few months ago, from the Georgetown Security Studies program, great program. And one of the highlights of that program for me was this class, Basics of Wargaming, with Sebastian and with Jamie, one of my teammates. I'm currently working in the Department of Defense. So I interned. This was kind of like an internship between the class in Georgetown and Command General Staff College. This was my first experience with wargaming. I didn't really know what wargaming was. I was just interested in war games because, reading about it in the news and in analysis and stuff like that. And I was interested in war games a little bit because I played some strategy PC games. I was familiar with Risk. I was familiar with Axis and Allies, for example. Before Georgetown, I went to Syracuse University for my undergrad. And before that, I was in the Marine Corps for almost 5 years.
Thank you, Zack. Like Zack, I'm a complete nerd. We both were in the same class together and both sort of bonded over our love of gaming. In general, I was in the same graduating class from the Georgetown Security Studies program this last May with Zack, which we sort of ended in our fall of 2021 with Sebastian's class. Prior to that, I was at Georgetown for undergrad, studying science, technology, and international affairs. And now out of grad school, and something I did while I was still in grad school is I work for a nonprofit called Business Executives for National Security, which does more or less nonprofit national security consulting, working to bridge the private and public sector and apply best business practices. So enough about us. Now let's talk about the game. So to get you sort of used to the world of the game, and then we'll go into some of its mechanics, we're going to describe the scenario that leads up to the conflict in 2025 that our game is based off. So our game is a game about near future combat between NATO and Russia, centered around the Norwegian theater with a heavy emphasis on logistics. We'll get into the reasons why we chose those requirements, why Norway, why logistics a little bit later, and it has a lot to do with our sponsors' requirements. But something sort of interesting to note as you read this is we drummed up this scenario before Russia invaded Ukraine in real life. So this was the fall, late summer of 2021. So we have had to make some amendments to the scenario sort of as it went to reflect reality. So in 2022, Russia fails to make military headway into Ukraine and eventually leaves the country. And then from 2023 to 2025, Russia ramps up its logistics and combat capabilities after facing international embarrassment. This is, sort of a dream item for us, but it was something that we added after because the idea of Russia and NATO going toe-to-toe logistically without some sort of drastic change in the next few years was required after the initial sort of winter of 2022. So going into June of 2025, President Zelensky of Ukraine reaffirms his intent to join NATO. This then leads to Russia invading, defensive war, of course. This then spirals into a conflict throughout the rest of the summer of 2025, where China makes moves near Taiwan, takes the Senkakus, and NATO and its allies move to defend both Ukraine and Taiwan and embroil the world in a third wide-scale conflict. The reason for this wide-scale conflict, and the reason why I didn't mention Norway once, sort of in that description, is we needed to create a universe where there were incredible resource constraints, where NATO and Russia could fight each other in a tertiary theater, Norway, yet vital theater, without being able to bring its full forces to bear. This is because, as we'll get into, this is a logistics-focused game rather than a combat-focused game. So we really wanted to force the player to have to deal with this austere environment in the most serious way. So in October, Russia invades Norway to cut off access to the northern seaports, to stop transatlantic supplies coming from the US into Europe to support its larger war aims. The objectives, Russian objective is to control enough Norwegian ports and territory to secure access to the North Sea and disrupt Allied supply lines to Europe. And the NATO objective is to push back the initial Russian advance and secure the ability to funnel supplies to Europe. So again, even in the sort of objectives of the game, it comes back to logistics. This isn't just a war of conquest and territory. This particular theater is about securing supply routes. And the victory conditions for Russia, it is to make it far enough up into the country to reach its rail network and de facto control the rest of Norway and its supply routes. And for NATO, it is to stop them from controlling the cities of Bodo, Narvik, or Tromsø. So the theme and topic. The overarching theme of this war game, as I mentioned, is how to handle resources and logistics in a near future conflict between Russia and NATO in the austere environment that is the Norwegian theater. So this was basically the sentence given to us by our sponsors, beginning of this journey. And it was how are officers going to handle logistics constraints in an environment that is very austere weather-wise and terrain-wise. So the basic engine of this game, and something that I think we'll probably repeat a lot in this, and like most games, you fully will understand it when you play it. But just to give a general description is first, you have to move supplies from out of the theater, be that from the continental US or from Russia, into the theater through A-pods or S-pods, so airports or seaports. Then once supplies have been moved to the theater, you have to move them around the theater, avoiding combat units and sort of protecting the theater-wide supply lines. And then the third part of it is anticipating those physical challenges of the environment, weather, terrain, etc. So in a broad scope, those are the three components of the engine of the game. The map. So one of the things that I personally contribute on this, as you can probably tell from the PowerPoint presentation and this map, I'm not the most design-oriented human on the planet, but was the map of the game. So in scope, you have Norway, along with a small amount of Sweden and Finland for Russia to invade. On the bottom left, and we'll sort of get into these mechanics as we go through the turn structure, you have the Russian forces and their sort of supply ability and their areas that they can hold their supplies. And then on the top of the map, inverted, is NATO and where they can hold their supplies. We used a combination of a spoken node and a hex map to represent the combat maneuver capabilities, but also the supply networks. So turn sequence, go into this really briefly, and then I will pass it off to Zach to talk a little bit about some different steps in the game. But first, you draw a card from the weather deck to determine the weather effects for this turn. As we'll talk about a little bit in the design process, weather was something that we struggled with the entire time we were designing this game, how to incorporate it, what level of randomness, what level of effectiveness it should have on your ability to move troops or supplies. So the way that we synthesize this is we would have a deck of predetermined cards. The order was random, but the sort of composition was predetermined for both the fall and the winter season. As you can see on the map in the slide before, the entire conflict spans from October to December. So sort of the end of the fall season into the middle of winter. So you draw this weather card, and that will determine whether or not it's a sunny day, which, spoiler alert, is pretty rare, or rainy and snowy, which is going to significantly hamper your ability to move supplies around the theater as well as your troops. Then you will spend your resources. So we had a few currencies in this game, which we'll explain, which allow you to move resources into the theater from either the continental US or Russia. Once you've spent that currency and have those resources en route, you then play whatever cards you have, which was Zach's sort of wheelhouse, so I'll let him take care of that, but was how we incorporated a lot of other elements, including some political, economic, and mostly combat assets that we didn't want to weigh down the logistics engine of the game, but we still felt was important. Then, once that is all transpired, you transport your supplies around the theater itself. So after they're in the theater, you move them to your units and around the different supply routes. And then finally, you move your units and you engage in combat with the other player. So every turn up until that is a simultaneous turn, allowing players to work together both for playability reasons, but also to represent the fact that things are happening in real time. And then once again, for the sake of playability, the move units phase is based off of you go, I go, with Russia taking the advantage at first, as it is their invasion. You then advance tokens in the delivery queue, which we'll explain. You consume whatever resources you need to consume, and you advance the date marker 1 week forward. So I will pass it to Zach to explain a little bit about the purchasing supplies phase.
Yeah, so as Jamie, briefly mentioned, in the purchase supply tokens phase, you pretty much get a fixed amount of resource points every turn. They don't roll over. It's basically like use it or lose it. So what you really want to do every turn is figure out how to most efficiently spend your resource points. This is the first constraint of the game. This is the first dilemma players are faced with. And it's a fun dilemma. This creates hard choices. And the things that you can do with the resource points is buy your supplies, which frankly is the core of the game. If your units at the front that you're pushing towards objectives, the S pods and the A pods, the ports to win the game, if they don't have fuel, food, and ammunition, they're just not going to do good. They're not going to be able to move. They're not going to be combat effective. So that's the most important thing players really should be thinking about is how do I get as many supplies as possible to my units at the front so that they can do the things to win the game. However, there's other options in the game too. You can purchase cards too, and the cards are mostly lethal effects. So we call these like debuff cards. These are cards that you use to apply a negative effect to your opponent's cards, or not cards, sorry, units mostly, and their ability to move supplies to their units. However, some of the cards act as like a negation card. So you could play cards to nullify a card that your opponent plays. But other cards are buff cards. So more like defensive cards or enabling cards, or kind of like effect multiplier cards. So sometimes you want to play cards. There's a lot of different cards that have logistic effects. So if you play some cards, these are going to have effect multiplier conditions to your ability to move supplies to your units, and in fact will give you sometimes kind of special abilities to move supplies to your units in ways that are unique to the side that you're playing. So NATO has slightly different buff cards and effect modifier cards for logistics than the Russians do. And the cards put an interesting element. They create an interesting choice for the player when they're deciding how to spend the resource points. Do I buy as many supplies as possible and only a few cards, or do I try to buy maybe up front in the beginning of the game many buff cards, for example, to have an initial turn 1, turn 2 effect multiplier on my team, so then the cards that I get later are better, or that when I move supplies later, it's easier to do. That's a choice the player has to make. And then to conclude this part, the third option is buying units. This isn't something that the players are doing often, but in many of the play tests that we've had and many of the actual games we've had, players find that their units are just getting blown up. They're just getting blown away really fast. And then you're halfway through the game, and you're like, I don't have any more units to like really play with. And so this was a kind of a mechanic that we introduced later in our play testing to make the game continue going and to allow the players more flexibility and to play a little bit more aggressively if they want to. They can buy units and move them into the game the same way supplies are moved into the game, the same way cards are moved into the game. So from there, we'll proceed.
Yeah, one thing that our sponsors and the people that helped us along the way really drilled into our head, and it probably most came out into this phase, that everything needs to have a cost. There needs to be some sort of trade-off. So if you're purchasing supply tokens, you're choosing not to purchase sort of lethal capabilities. If you're purchasing cards, that may hurt you down the line. One thing that is important and is probably best represented graphically is the fact that when you purchase supplies, it goes into your supply queue. So for the continental US and for the NATO side, your supplies are coming all the way from across the Atlantic. So when you purchase either food, fuel, ammo, or certain assets that would require being shipped across the ocean, it will take at least 3 turns for them to get into Norway. That represents a few weeks of real life time, and is supposed to be representative of the fact that you have to plan ahead. It may be November right now and you're not too worried about the winter, but if you don't start stockpiling food in 3 or 4 turns when it's the dead of winter and your soldiers are starving, you will plan pretty poorly. For Russia, that supply line is a little bit shorter. It's only 2 turns to get, to represent the fact that it is just a much shorter distance to get forces and supplies into the field. So I'll let you ruminate on that for a little bit when we go into this next phase, which Zach described more or less, is the cards. So this is an example of, the Special Operations Forces is a Russia card, which allows you to reduce the infrastructure level or the throughput of an APOD or an SPOD by 1, or destroy a NATO logistics card. So after you've spent your resources, you have the ability to play the cards that you have in your hand. Sometimes when we ran the game, we started players off with cards. We found that was helpful for teaching people, and we'll get into how we set up our different play tests later. Other times they had to really wait and make those initial purchasing decisions. But if NATO has and decides to play in their hand the military police card, this will negate the Russian card. So most of our cards in the deck have something that will negate it, or at least offset it in some way with some asymmetries baked in. This is an example of when cards will go through. So if the NATO side plays 2 UAVs, which allows them to destroy 2 supplies of their choice, and the Russian side only has 1 SAM to play, one of the UAVs will get shot down and the other UAV will get through. The UAV is still expended in this way. This was a mostly game design decision. If people were stockpiling cards, it just changed the sort of makeup of the game in a way that we didn't like. But they still spend the UAV and they get to use the effect. So now into the transport supplies phase. So if you think back to
Yeah, let me go back to the cards a little bit. And I just want to say one reason that we have the cards is this was like day 1, week 1, week 2 game design. As soon as the project was assigned to us, I knew right from the get-go that after talking to the sponsors and stuff, I knew the cards were going to be a fantastic mechanic in the game. They're in a lot of games, so it's not like they're they're original in our game. But one thing about our game is it needed to be like a logistics focused game. It's not, although as you're playing it, there's an obvious important combat element in the game. The focus is not on super big operational maneuvering and how can I engage the enemy and have superior tactics. That's not the purpose of the game. So how do you have a logistics game and still have like an exciting, cool, sexy element to it without, because logistics is like, if there's not many like people who get, pumped up and revved up for logistics. I'm sure there's somebody in this room that does, but I personally, I don't. I'm much more interested in logistics now, especially after designing this game. But cards was a fantastic way to make the game exciting, at least to me. And I think my partners would agree.
100% agree on all points. And I think, we got pretty lucky, though that's not the right word to use, that there was a lot more attention focusing on logistics just because of when we were designing this game and sort of global events. So that definitely contributed. So going into phase 4, after you have played your cards, so you've now, purchased your resources, put them in the supply queue, you played your cards, so whatever effects are going to transpire have transpired. Then you go into the transport supplies phase. One of the things that we learned from the interviews that we conducted with people that work in the logistics community is that it's one whole thing to, everyone thinks about moving supplies around the theater, but first you have to get them into the theater. So this is where the throughput of our A pods and our S pods come into play. This is something that can be affected by enemy units, can be affected by enemy cards, but certain ports and airports can only hold a certain amount of supplies per turn. So especially for NATO, which controls the bulk of the ports and airports at the beginning of the game, it is a game of where do I put things through and how do I move them around, in addition to just getting them to the theater. We wanted those to be two distinct challenges, so we designed it that way. So in order to follow a unit through, one unit can pretty much take up the entire throughput of a Bodo, for example. It's brigade size, so it's really flowing in a lot of troops and the supplies that they carry with them naturally. In order to deliver supplies to a seaport, which are much larger in throughput than airport, you also must control the nearest APOD. Something that Doc Starrett and Mike Dunn heard plenty of conversations about, we're definitely going to talk about later, is air superiority. Something you're not going to hear us say a lot of in this game is, air superiority and naval superiority. That may seem weird in an environment like Norway, which is mostly coastline, and air assets are so important, especially in the modern way of war. That's going to come down to sponsor constraints, and something that was actually a very fun challenge to deal with once we got over the initial frustration. But one way that we abstracted that, as all games are a certain level of abstraction, is that you have to control the nearest airport to a seaport, or else there's sort of a bubble where you won't be able to get supplies in. This led to a lot of very novel strategies of completely abandoning seaports, but just controlling the relevant airports and slowing down forces that way. Additionally, if there is a unit near your seaport, it's going to make it very hard for you to move troops into it. So transporting supplies, this is something that probably had the biggest overhaul in the entire course of our design of the game. It was one of the mechanics that I think we're most proud of the game, and also one of them that was added completely after we finished the class with Sebastian. We had a slightly longer design timeline, which we'll get into on this game, but this whole idea was centered on the idea of US using combat sustainment support battalions, or CSSBs. So we wanted logistics to not only be challenging and novel, but also fun. So we built in a mechanic where you were able to build modular logistics nodes through the combat sustainment support battalion, all using real life companies and sort of analogous components to move your supplies around the map. So for example, your CSSB could have a transport company. This is in the form of a card, and both sides start out with a certain amount of these that generates 20 LP per turn at a range of 10. Now, what does that mean without playing the game? Probably not a lot to you at the moment, but hopefully through the Q&A and through this presentation, it'll make a little bit more sense. Basically, going back to the hex and node map at the beginning, your CSSB is a unit that physically exists on the map that allows you to project logistics capability into the theater. For the purpose of game design, we had to have Russia and NATO have very similar capabilities logistics-wise. This includes Russia having some magical modular logistics capability that's reflective of the US one. Whether that is based in reality or not is a whole nother discussion, but for the purpose of this being an educational war game, we needed both sides to have a fair shot. So if you have a CSSB on the map, let's say it's in the town of Bodo or Narvik, then 10 nodes away from there, you have the capability of moving supplies around. As opposed to the resource point currency that is used to move supplies into the theater, these CSSBs generate a separate currency called logistics points, which represent your ability to move things across the node. So pretty simply, moving one unit of fuel, for example, which costs one resource point to get into the theater, it will cost one logistics point to move it one node across the map. This doesn't seem like a lot, especially that one transport company will generate 20 logistics points per turn. But if you're trying to transport, let's say, 5 units of fuel, you can only move them 4 nodes, which is barely the distance between any 2 cities in any one turn. So one thing that changed the way we played the game, and you'll see some older versions of the map that have different logistics engines, is that you not only have this resource that you have the ability to build up via cards as well as degrade via opposing cards, but because the CSSB is represented by an actual unit on the field, you have to protect it from combat maneuver. There were so many games where someone played an amazing first few rounds and really were setting themselves up for success and just truly forgot to leave any rear guard to protect their supplies and lost their entire network in the beginning of the war. And that was sort of it. We had to say sorry. That was a hard lesson learned. Let's try it again.
Yeah,
so
and
Zach, I don't know if you have anything you want to add on that.
Yeah, I just want to add too that this creates one of the most interesting dynamics of the game, which is, as Jamie said, you get 20 logistics points, and let's say you get a card that boosts it to 30 or to 40. You think that's a lot, but when you have 3 to 4, 6 combat units on the map, and they all need fuel, they all need ammo, they all need food to function correctly, you have to start thinking in trade-offs. And you're like, okay, well, I've got this many objectives now. If you're playing Russia, I got this many objectives now. I need more fuel, but winter's coming up. So I know if I don't get food to these units, they're going to fall to 50% combat reduction value. And I can't have that. So you get these interesting dilemmas where you're constantly thinking about what you're prioritizing. Are you trying to race up the map, or are you playing defensively? If you're NATO, do you just want to go to a port and just stock up on tons of ammunition? You're like, I don't really need fuel because I don't really plan on moving very much. I'm just going to stock up on food and ammo. So there's these dynamics. And then you add in the cards and then the weather, and you have lethal missile effects, for example, or cyber effects or whatever, special operations. Then you have the weather. It makes for a variable and dynamic interactions in the game.
100%. And I see a question in the chat, which I'll take right now because it's relevant to the next part of this turn sequence, which is the moving units and engaging in combat phase. And it's, what are the colors on the map mean? This was one of my few design moments in creating the map. Yeah, the colors on the map, exactly. They represent different types of terrain. So one thing that was not only imparted on us at the beginning of this process, when we were told by our sponsors that we were going to work in Norway, but also through our research and our attempt to make a game that was actually playable, is that the terrain in Norway sucks. It's really bad, and I would never want to get into a conflict there because it's really, really hard to move. So on the map, the dark green is difficult terrain. So the dark green is pretty much the best terrain you're going to get even in Norway, and that represents a higher fuel cost to traverse if you are a unit. Mostly it's mountains and valleys, so even that was, I think, a little bit of a flub on our part to make the game more playable. For maneuver, going off the roads is almost always a bad idea, but that's what the dark green represents. This is on the legend in the top left, but it's probably pretty hard to see. The brown is mountains and hills, also incredibly high cost to get anything across it. I believe it costs something like 6 LP to move 1 hex. So you're blowing all your fuel or all your logistics points to move across that. And then the white is impassable glacier. The light green that you see on the bottom, mostly through Sweden and Finland, is flat tundra. This still has a decent cost and is much less preferable to using the roads. But that area was included to allow for a little bit more maneuverability and just from a game design standpoint, make it a little bit more fun and challenging to conduct combat operations. So going on to phase 5 from there, and please feel free to add questions as we go, and there'll be a time when we can take questions a few times during this presentation, is the move units and combat phase. Sadly, John Abshire is here with us tonight. He was the genius behind our adjudication system, but basically what happens here is, depending on who has initiative, which is Russia at first, and depending on different things that happen in the game, will continue to be Russia. You will be able to expend all the resources that you so difficultly got to your units. So if you want to expend a fuel token, that will allow you to move 10 hexes, or depending on their cost for the terrain, or 10 nodes. You can only expend one fuel token per turn, as we'll see going back to the map. 10 nodes gets you about a third to a quarter, more or less, across Norway. Something we struggled with a lot at the beginning was deciding, these are roads. The time span is a week or 2 weeks, depending on what version of the game we were playing. For one turn, why can't a bunch of trucks drive up the entire length of Norway in a few weeks? It's not that long of a country. The reason we settled on intellectually was, that would make no sense. They're sort of moving at a tactical crawl, and then in a game design perspective, we had people invading Oslo in one turn, and that made a really boring game. So if you spend a class 3, you can move either 10 nodes, and you declare all your moves before you do your attacks. Once you have moved and there's a certain element of a zone of control, not being able to slip immediately by troops, that nature, you then engage in combat. So once you moved all your units, you declare combat, you declare how much ammo you want to expend, and then you roll your dice. So just quickly going into that, you can see on the right here, this is a Russian motorized brigade. They have 5 total HP, which I'll explain, and right under that it says 8 dice. So those 9 larger boxes to the right of that image represent the total carrying capacity of that unit. So it could hold, 9 things of fuel, 9 things of ammo, 9 units of food, or some combination thereof. In order to fire off 3 dice worth of shots, you have to expend 1 ammo. So one thing that we talked about a lot, especially with some RD people that we interviewed, is not all ammos are created equal. It's really heavy to carry really heavy ammo, and it's considerably more difficult. So having sort of a high potential combat power also had to come with the cost of sustaining that high combat power. That was one of the learning objectives that our sponsors at CGSC really wanted to impart on their students. So the way we baked into the game is this motorized brigade, which Russia has plenty of, as opposed to the light units of NATO, has the potential to absolutely thwomp a NATO light unit with 8 die total. If you have, if the attacker has a 5 or a 6, it gets a hit, so it degrades 1 HP. If they roll a 4 or a 6 on defense to represent a defender's advantage, they do 1 damage to the attacker. To get that full 8 dice, you have to spend 3 ammo. 3 ammo may not sound like a lot, but when we play tested it out, it was very, very rare that the Russians were able to actually fully utilize their full potential combat power, because sustaining it became so costly, and moving it around the map and protecting the supply lines was very difficult. That was one of the learning objectives, potentially aired more on the side of learning and education than realism there, but that is how we accomplish that. Once the combat has been adjudicated, so the attacker declares how much ammo it's spending, the defender declares how much ammo it's spending, the dice are rolled, things are subtracted, and the other person gets to go through their move and attack phase. Zach, is there anything I missed in that?
Yeah, I'll just add that we'll probably go into a little bit more later, but when you play the game, you find that you're blowing through a lot of ammo. Like you do one big combat engagement with your units, and pretty much all your units are almost all out of ammo, unless you were wise enough or lucky enough, one or the other, to really stock up on ammo with one of your units. And typically only 1 or 2 of your units are really stocked up with a lot of ammo. You'll find that the other half, your total force in the country is pretty low on ammo. And it's interesting that we designed the game that way, based off a lot of feedback from consulting with logistics experts and people who understand this aspect of warfare really well. And it's interesting that you're actually seeing it playing out in like Ukraine today, which is like US already stockpiles. This is in the news recently. It's low, and now you see Russia buying artillery ammunition from North Korea. So I think that it was an interesting. You play the game and you see like, wow, ammo goes really fast, and you can easily see that in a sustained long-term war, how fast you can burn through a lot of ammo.
Yeah, and in terms of trade-offs, nothing made us as game designers giddier than when one side, Russia moves up halfway through the country and they're positioned right outside of Bodo or even Oslo, and they realize they forgot to pack ammo, or on the converse where they're loaded up with ammo and they run out of fuel at the last second. Those were the kind of trade-offs that we wanted to impart as far as learning objectives, and that's sort of how this system was designed. So of course, it makes more sense when you play it. So going back to the turn sequence before we move on to other parts of the presentation, as mentioned before, and hopefully this makes a little bit more sense now, weather determines how much logistics points you can spend in a turn. The heaviest weather decreasing your logistics capability in the theater by more than half, as well as it determines how much you can maneuver. Spending one fuel in heavy weather environments gets you a fraction of the distance as it does in nice weather, although those days are few. You then spend resources in the form of resource points, or RP, to bring things from out of the theater, be that supply tokens or cards, into the theater. That is on a delay of 2 to 3 turns, depending on if you're Russia or NATO. You then play the cards that are in your hand at the time to lay down any effects that you need. You then transport supplies within the theater using your modular logistics network, your CSSBs, and the MTO, which is the Russian equivalent. Something I guess to add there is there's more than just the one card that we showed you. There are cards that Russia has that allow you to build railroads to the Russian mainland and pipelines, as well as cards that target both of those systems. You then move units and engage in combat depending on who has the initiative, moving all your units and then spending your fuel and ammo, reaping the rewards of either a good or a very bad logistics network. You then advance supply tokens in the A-pod or S-pod delivery queue, consume food. One thing we sort of brushed over briefly, but we'll talk about if anyone has any questions, is that units have to consume food. In the fall, it's not that bad. It's once every 2 turns. Players usually forget about it. In the winter, you double your caloric intake if you're on the battlefield. So you have to immediately have twice as much food ready as you thought you did. This almost always ruffled the feathers of first-time players, but is representative of something you have to think about when dealing with an austere environment like Norway. And then you advance the date token and you move on to the next turn. So I will pause briefly. I don't see any in the chat immediately, but if anyone has any questions on this part, we'll go on to the design portion after.
I think that there doesn't appear to be any questions in the chat, but I do have one for you. Actually, never mind. We've got one from Jonah Ellens.
Jonah.
And
I knew someone was going to ask
Sweden
that.
and Finland in NATO in this scenario?
I knew someone was going to ask that. So no, not necessarily, but yes, de facto. So when we designed this, Sweden and Finland hadn't made their bids to join NATO, or at least hadn't made that in widely circled news reports. I'm happy we did include them. One of the reasons we did, as you can see on the map here, was game design. So Russia made the somewhat confusing decision to run through Finland and Sweden in our scenario so that it could attack Norway from a different angle. As you can see, Sweden and Finland are cut off in kind of a weird way. It may be hard to see on the webinar, but there's a light gray line that traces the border of Sweden and Finland in reality. This was a sort of deal where Sweden and Finland are busy in this larger war. Yeah, they joined NATO, not as part of NATO, because that wasn't necessarily reality when we designed the game, but as de facto allies. But they're embroiled in conflict in their southern parts of their countries. So there are no Swedish troops, there are no Finnish troops in this game. That is something we get questions about a lot, and came down to when we first play tested this game. We only had the route through Norway, and it was a very boring and not particularly educational tug of war match, which if conflict in Norway actually occurred without Sweden and Finland being involved, it would be. There's only one main road through Norway, and even that we didn't model necessarily as brutally as we could have. So the short answer is no, they were not in NATO, because that's not how we designed the game originally. In future updates, we probably will just de facto include them in by 2025. But the reason why we included parts of their territory in the game was from a game design perspective, to allow there to be a second route for Russian invasion and NATO defense, as well as paths in between NATO, Sweden, and Finland. Something that was also discussed and never got into the final game regarding that was to punish the Russian player, for invading Finland and Sweden. This is one of the parts of our game that doesn't really have a cost. Russia is not disincentivized to invade Sweden and Finland. Something Sebastian and Doc Starrett and Mike Dunn talked to us about was potentially having, if the Russian player decides to use that separate route, Swedish and Finnish troops spawn for the NATO side, or there's a chance they spawn, or there's some sort of card penalty. Didn't make it in the final game because it sort of disrupted the balance, and like we'll talk about later, you at some point have to just call a game what it is and throw it out into the world and play it and do what you're going to do. But that is a very good question.
I think we can move on, Jamie.
Yep, perfect.
But just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. They'll get to them once they finish talking about their design process.
So, design process. Why Norway and why logistics? As Zach mentioned, logistics isn't necessarily the sexiest topic in the world at first glance. And Norway is not an environment, at least I had thought too critically about, especially with rumblings going on in Taiwan and Ukraine. And the reason for that is because our sponsors made us. Something that we'll talk about a little bit is we were the only group in Sebastian's class that had sponsors. I now understand that at least 3 or 4 of the groups, if not all the groups, have sponsors for their projects, which I don't know what we unleashed on those students. But I feel they're very lucky to have that opportunity. But it was a really, really important lesson, especially as first-time wargamers, to have the opportunity to work with sponsors. We had considerably more constraints on our game. We were told at the beginning that our sponsor was going to be the Command General Staff College. Todd Gugesberg is the professor of the theater sustainment class elective that we were designing the game for. He was focusing this unit on Norway and logistics in an austere environment. So that much was sort of charted out for us. And then we had Doc Starrett and Mike Dunn as part of this sort of sponsored team at the Command and General Staff College, though Todd was our ultimate, client, but helping us design the game. We found this in some ways limiting, but in almost always a good kind of limiting. We were able to very early jump into what the meat and bones of the game was and explore a topic that we probably wouldn't have thought of before, which was really, really nice, and is why we chose both Norway and logistics. Other groups had really, really fun subjects, not that ours wasn't, like the Banana Wars, sort of post-war reconstruction South, politics engagement, as well as an AI game. So we got the one that was most combat focused, but obviously the logistics 10. Something else we had to keep in mind when we were designing the game was our audience. This is true of any game, but was made slightly easier because we didn't have to figure out who our audience was going to be. It was told to us. It was 9 logistics officers, 3 medical service, an engineer and aviation officer, and 1 Marine Corps logistics officer. So the ultimate goal of this game is we were going to go out in April of 2022 to the Command and General Staff College during the actual unit that Todd was teaching to these students and run the game for them as part of their curriculum. This gave a great deal of clarity on our project from day one, which was really, really nice, and was how we developed the game as we did. We'll get a little bit more into the sponsor dynamics in a little bit, but I will pass it to Zach to talk a little bit about why Norway and logistics are relevant in a broader, not just Command and General Staff College sense.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, throw in some context, and I guess lessons learned is coming later, but it's interesting because I'm sure most of you have heard the saying, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics, and it's like, although I don't 100% agree with that, I think the saying is still apt because it's funny because I just recently I've been replaying a Dan Carlin podcast, the Blueprint from Armageddon, which talked about like World War I, and it's funny how much logistics like pops up in that podcast about even World War I, where like things were static and it was like trench warfare. People weren't really moving around a whole lot. Just how important logistics still was is like a bean counters war, and then you fast forward from early 20th century to today in Ukraine, and it's like, yes, warfare is so much more futuristic and modern, but there's just some elements that never go away, and logistics is just never going to go away. And if you're bad at logistics, you're not going to be good at conducting in warfare. So we see it throughout history, and we see it today. And in designing this game, as a designer, I would be interested more in how first-time players play it, because I don't really have that objectivity anymore. When I play it, I know how to play the game really well because I designed it. But even as a designer, though that lesson really got hammered home for me, is just like, if you don't do logistics right, things are going to be screwed up. And this game is very abstract. It's not even close to the real thing, but it still was a great learning experience for me.
And sort of responding to Mike Dunn's comment in the chat, there was, and I didn't, I guess, fully internalize this until we showed up to the Command and General Staff College to do our first day of demos. There was an officer from Norway there in attendance as a guest for the class, which was very frightening to walk into, though he was the very nicest guy on the planet, and I'll never forget that. At the end, he came up to me, he said, "That was very good, that was very interesting, I really liked it." But apparently I had gotten the location of an airport completely wrong, about on the other side of the country. That's still in the game, we never fixed it. But just to note that there's always more to improve, and it's really good to get an outside perspective, especially from outside of the country when you're making a game about their country. So moving on, map and design iterations. Something else that I think is really important, and actually in preparation for this webinar, I sort of reflected on quite a bit, was how much our game changed while we were building it, and how much it changed from the beginning to the end. So as you can see here, this is the final map of the game, and we'll get into the sort of later map iterations in a bit. Our timeline, this is also, not necessarily unique to Sebastian's course, but somewhat of a condensed timeline for designing a war game in general, especially the first time. By week 3, so 3 weeks after we had started the class, we needed to have an initial design plan for the game. So we needed the scope, we needed to do all of our basic research. This was, and I think Zach would agree, probably the easiest part for us relative to our other classmates, because we had been given, at least a general scoping of the game. We'd have to define and redefine the scope several times throughout the weeks and the months of designing it. But this first 3 weeks was just sort of basic research. We then would identify and test game mechanics, many of which never made it into the final game. There are versions of our map that have an entire air superiority mechanic, which we tried again to include, and it never made it into the final version. By week 7, we had to produce a memo write-up on all the mechanics and components to be included. I thought this was useful because it forced us to actually write down on a piece of paper and realize the physical constraints of our game. Something that was unique to us also is we had been given not only a player count, so we needed 2 teams of 2 per game, but also a time limit. This was going to be, a game that needed to be run in a little under 2 hours. So we had to cover a good amount of turns in that time. So this was when we really came to terms with what our sponsors required at the end of the day, and those sort of hard physical constraints, and refined through playtesting. The playtesting into the final presentation weeks, so weeks sort of 7 through 13. The only thing I can say about that is we should have done more playtesting. There was so much value in playtesting with Zach, John, and I, and then whenever we got an opportunity to let someone else play the game, which we didn't want to give up, our baby at that time. So we thought it was so imperfect. We learned so much. They broke it and blew it up in all the best ways. And that was definitely one of the more interesting parts for me. Then we give our final presentation in class playtest, and then polished and edited it and presented it to outside members of the wargaming community as part of Sebastian's final. Zach, do you have anything you want to touch on here?
No, I thought that was pretty good. I just want to, I see Nick's question here, and I'm sure you can jump in on this too, but I'll jump in on it first. Every time I feel like we constantly felt like under pressure, really good pressure to make like big changes. Honestly, our sponsors helped us a lot with this. Dr. Starrett told us, early on, after we play test, kind of play test with the purpose of, kind of breaking your game. Like when you test it, really try to find the gaps and the holes in the game and try to break it. If somebody breaks your game play testing it for you, don't get upset. That's actually like a really good thing. And then when somebody breaks it and you go back to the drawing board and you're like, okay, that didn't work, or that's like totally broken, it's totally exploitable by somebody who figures it out, or this is just a boring part of the game, or whatever isn't working, whatever you want to change. Make big changes. Don't make small changes. It's easier to make like a huge change and then to play test it again and go, okay, we changed it too much. Now we know if we go 50% of that big change, we're probably going to be right where we want to be. But if you make a small change, I think you have to play test it more, and nobody has enough time to do 100 play tests. I think we play tested this game like a total before its final play, just like probably like a few months ago, or like I think like a few months ago or something like that. In May, I think we play tested the game like together, me, Jamie, and John, like 10 times or a dozen times, but each play test was like almost a full, like our first like 4 or 5 play tests were like maybe 6 or 7 play tests were like half play tests, because we'd play for 3, 4, 5 hours and we'd just be like, all right, like the game's too long. And we'd find that often we break down and have like an hour-long discussion on like air superiority, or like this combat mechanic, or how we're moving fuel to the front, and every time we broke something, every time we found something we didn't like, we just made a huge change and multiple changes, and play test it again, and just make big dramatic changes.
Yeah, and just sort of adding on that briefly, though, I think you did a pretty good job describing it. Having other people play test your game was amazing. I know none of us had thought to drop a Russian VDV unit into Oslo on turn 1 and just end the game immediately. One of our previous mechanics in the game allowed for that. And as soon as we saw someone else do it, because why would we ever think of doing that? That was pretty eye-opening. And every time someone beat the game in less than 1 turn, that was kind of horrific at the moment, but exciting in hindsight. So this is our sort of 14-week timeline, which is representative of Sebastian's Basics of Wargaming design course. But then we had a whole nother about 14 weeks before we presented at CGSC. So as you can see there at the bottom, that is a picture from our time at CGSC. You can see my decapitated head or body sort of to the left there, and then professor and sponsor Todd on the right there. And then those are all of our play testers, effectively, though our customers in the final game. So for as much time as we spent designing the game and getting it to a point where we felt happy about presenting it as a final project in a master's level course, we spent the same amount of time just refining it, just making little iterations, making the game that much better, which is definitely something that I think is important to impart. Is we could have, this could be week 14 to infinity. It's just there's always more that you can do, and eventually you have to deliver it to your client, to your sponsor. But those were some of the best mechanics came out. That's where our modular logistics system came out. And honestly, what we learned from running about 12 or 16 versions of the game while we were at the CGSC for those few days, going into the next version of the game, absolutely crucial. So going on to the map, this is just sort of a visual representation of what we're talking about for how much the game changed. So this was the final map as of April of 2022. So when we presented at CGSC, this was the first version of the map. Somewhat recognizable, really showing my artistic prowess here. But as you can see, Sweden and Finland are in no way included. There's no hex system whatsoever. There's a few missing cities. APODs aren't included. There's no airports whatsoever. Supply routes are completely different, as well as this very odd hex or a spoken node system that we designed that didn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense, but we thought was kind of pretty. Other than that, some of the components remain the same. You have APODs or at least the SPODs at the time down there representing their infrastructure levels. You have a few units that the Russians and the NATO troops can use, as well as some semblance of what we would do with our cards. You can see at the bottom there's a static logistics points counter, which we did away with the modular logistics system, as well as the resource points. So that is the map version 1. And this right here is the actual map version 1. This was the first crack we made at the game, and I'm not entirely sure what it is, even though I'm the one who made it. we went from this, which was this sort of hodgepodge of Norway cut to 3 different sections where we thought, this is going to be a game that has to do with so much combat and maneuver. We need to really zoom in on these portions of the map, and we are going to expand out and allow for so much, traveling around and maneuver capability. This was our first crack without doing our basic research. So in preparing for this, looking back at this, I was pretty happy with where we ended up. But I thought that this was, a relevant reminder that, especially, for students taking this class and, aspiring new war gamers, your game is going to be unrecognizable, even from one version to the next, let alone the first version where we hadn't put nearly enough thought into the mechanics. And mostly that was great feedback from Zach and John on why my maps were so bad and why they needed to be better, which I appreciated to a great degree. So this is the final map. Again, Zach, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just want to answer that question real quick, because that's a question that we've gotten multiple times, or similar versions of, which is like this multiple domain aspect of the game. And me, Jamie, and John had dozens of conversations about it, and the sponsors even had many conversations with us about this too, which is, how do you account for modern warfare if you're not talking about, especially Norway? Jamie brought it up in the beginning of this presentation, but like Norway is, any real war, you're going to have a huge maritime component. You're going to have, and you can't really talk about logistics without talking about the maritime components, sea interdiction, or the air component. You're going to be interdicting supplies with, bombers and UAVs and all that stuff. And then you add the space and the cyber and everything. And so there's some hand waving involved. But we had strict constraints. But the best way we could tackle this was with the cards. That was an easy way we could say, we just got rid of the whole air component of the game because it added the game is a 3-hour game. The air component made the game like a 5-hour game almost. It was ridiculous. So we just got rid of the air component. We said, we'll add all the air stuff to cards. We'll have F-35 cards. We'll have B-52 cards. We'll have a ton of different cards for both sides that deal with the air component. And then we have the sea component too. Like the Russians have subs that they can use to interdict supplies coming from CONUS, which reduces resource points, for example, for NATO. So that was the way that we did it, was with the cards.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, specifically for the cyber component, bringing again all the cards back to logistics. Some of our cyber capabilities allow you to target enemy infrastructure and confound their throughput, or target the enemy's in-theater logistics capabilities, or their ability to generate research points or resource points. And then on the other side, you had the ability to defend against those attacks. And then, Russia, as per, some of our research, and also just to introduce amusing asymmetry into the game, had different cyber capabilities than the US and vice versa. In addition to air, that was something that we felt players really enjoyed playing with, and allowed us to abstract, because at the end of the day, all games are abstractions to a certain degree, those components of the game. But that is something that we could have spent so much more time fleshing out, but for the purpose of the scope of what our sponsors wanted, that is what we did. And feel free to ask follow-ups on that too as we shoot through this. There you go, questions. So that's sort of the initial end of the design part of the presentation, though when we talk about our lessons learned, we're going to talk a lot about design. So if there's any questions immediately, if not, I will sort of start zooming through this, and we'll take them as they come in.
It looks like we have one or two. Sorry. This is for the CGSC leadership, but I suppose you guys can get in on this too. How was the game received by students?
I like to think it was received very well. I'll let them answer that in the chat. But one of the things I guess that I can speak to, not necessarily how they received it, but what they allowed us, like what they sort of gave to us when we ran it by those students. They had a lot of commentary, which is something we really wanted going into the CGSC presentation. As you saw, they come from a variety of different service backgrounds, predominantly Army, but different sort of MOSs within the service. And their feedback was invaluable. One thing that actually segues very nicely, while CGSC leadership, if they're still on, is typing into the chat, is what some of the lessons learned were, or as we kind of call it, how did we get from bad to slightly less bad? So playtesting, as we talked about a little bit before, playtesting was the like be all end all. If I could do it all over again, what would I do differently? I'd just test a bunch more. Every test was leaps and bounds above the last, and the amount that Zach, John, and I would just bicker at each other for the entire playtest and get nothing done paled in comparison to the progress we made when we just let other people play our game and watched. So that is definitely advice I would give.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that, I thought that our team was very disciplined about that. You know, I think we set like hard targets to play test once every 2 weeks. And we would play test for at least 3.5, 4 hours, sometimes 5 hours. And we'd meet on the weekends. It was actually a great time. Sometimes it'd be a great time. And we were just really disciplined about that because it started to feel like we were making really great progress when you play test twice in a row and you're like, it's kind of feels okay. But then like you keep making those dramatic changes, then you play test the third time, and then, you know, we're all just, you know, looking at each other because you can feel like the magic kind of happening. You're like, whoa, this game is playable. Like this game's got wheels now, it's moving. And then you play test twice more and you're like, whoa, this game is way different from the initial design. So that was a great experience.
Another question, which is a really, really good one and one of my favorites, is did the students adapt playing styles if they played the game before? My favorite part about CGSC, and this is how we designed it with Todd and Doc Starrett and Mike Dunn, was that each group, and it was the same group every time, so there were about 12 students, or I guess there were 16 students because there was 4 groups of 4, got to play the game 3 times. So the first day we came in, and this was something that was told to us, and until we failed at it, we didn't quite understand the lesson. But the first play test, we held their hands the entire time. I personally was very reluctant to do that because I was like, no, they should be able to make all the player choices they want and have agency. But because we were lucky enough to have many iterations with them, eventually we learned the lesson of this first iteration. You run through 2 or 3 turns. You tell them exactly what they need to do on their first turn. You know, everybody buy this card. Everybody do this. And then after turn 1, you sort of let them loose just to wet their whistle a little bit. So we had 4 hours one day, 4 hours the next day. So that took about the first 2 hours on the first day. On the second playtest, we felt that it was less that they were fighting the game and more that they were playing the game. So they had an understanding of what caused what affected one. They hadn't gotten to winter yet at that time. The first playthrough only got them through a little bit of fall. But you could see they were, as they were going through the turns, asking for a lot less help, and their play style was considerably more aggressive generally than it was the first time because they felt confident in their capabilities and how to use the cards. But really where I thought was the most useful was the third play test. So they had a full, I think it was about 2 days. So we did on like a Tuesday and a Thursday to think about it. And then they had a 4-hour session where they could just play the game, you know, fully go for as hard and as long as they want, finish the game all the way through the final turn, and then do an after action. And watching them play the third time, they went from the first game fighting the game, the second game playing the game, and in the third game you could really see them begin to master it. So in turn 1, you see the 2 teammates talking to one another about, all right, hey, this is where we need to set up our board state at the beginning of this game, because in turn 6, oh boy, that winter is going to suck. And you know, that was also part of the reason why Todd, the sponsor, wanted to have 2 people on each side. He wanted, as a teacher, because it is an educational game, to hear the players talking back and forth. And definitely something that I was a little bit hesitant with at first when we were designing, because I thought that would take away some of the, you know, secrecy if both sides could kind of hear what the other side was saying. But after experiencing it, I would, you know, a sample size of 1, highly recommend for an educational game, especially in a classroom setting, because hearing the students talk to one another and debate strategy was more insightful to our game, I thought, than almost any other playtest we had, and really got to the learning objectives in such a strong way. So in my dream world, no one would be allowed to tell me anything about this game until they played it 3 times. Obviously, that's not how that works, and we've had to run demos in different ways. But style play
Yeah,
difference, Russia or NATO? Yeah, Zach.
So we like, and this came through playtesting because we like, for example, early in our playtests, the NATO player was just heavily encouraged to kind of turtle up, like go to the closest S pod to the Russians, or even let them take one, like whatever, you can have that one. And I'll just turtle up here, and I'll just keep stockpiling tons of ammunition. I'll never move. And that was the initial reason why. So Jamie kind of referred to it as like the tug of war aspect of it. It felt like World War One. It was just like static, it was like somewhere like Bodo, I think, Jamie. Russia would get to Bodo, NATO would literally let them come to Bodo and not even contest the land that they took, and just, like gates of Thermopylae, Persians smashing into the Spartans, nothing moves. It just stays that way the whole game. And so that's where me, Jamie, and John were like, let's open the game up a little bit. Like, let's make a corridor through Sweden that the Russian can go, okay, that's really cool that you're sitting there. I'm just going to go around you. And that's why we came up with things like airborne, for the Russians, the VDV. And so that was like an early thing. And then we changed it. And there are many different styles to play too. Like you can play a game and actually do pretty well by just stocking up on tons of lethal effects. If you get to a point where you want to get on the map and you're just like, okay, I just want to focus on degrading my opponent's logistics network and ability to resupply. And that works. But another way of playing the game, if you're the Russians and you buy tons of logistics enabling effects, which is kind of funny because we know that they don't do that. But it turns out, in the game, the way we designed it, if you do that, your team or whatever side you're playing, you can move really far, really fast, and you can move a ton of supplies pretty easily, and you can put your opponent in a bad spot, because then they're like, oh crap, like I didn't invest in my logistics and my opponent did, and they're moving a lot faster.
And one thing on our sort of wish list, if in the future / if we had more time before the CGSC presentation, there were asymmetries that we introduced, like Zach mentioned. The Russians are much heavier troops. They're mostly, if not all, motorized. And NATO is almost entirely light, just given the constraints that we decided to put on the players at the beginning of the game. So that introduced an asymmetry in playstyle. What kind of resources NATO had to procure as the defender, and what kind of resources Russia had to procure as the attacker, moving all these heavy troops. But if we'd had more time / in the future, breaking the game with asymmetries and really throwing a lot more interesting asymmetries in there and then rebalancing it is something we talked about a lot. And something we tried a little bit to do with the cards and a little bit to do with the way we handled our movement and attack systems, which worked to a certain degree, but something I wish we could have seen more of, and definitely would have, lesson learned, done maybe a little bit differently. Just going on to the next slide, lessons learned. Playtests, internal and external. We covered this a little bit earlier as a result of a question, but external playtests, there was a time for internal playtests, definitely. And those several hour long discussions between Zach, John, and I were vital. But sometimes we got in the way of our own success a little bit. And opening up to our classmates was really, really valuable. Opening up to other professionals. Every time we've demoed it, we've learned something new. Zach, I don't know if you want to talk about the first time we tried to play Race to the Rhine and how that influenced our game design.
Yeah, that's a great game. We played that game and we really enjoyed it, and we instantly I felt inspired. I was like, okay, I think I know how to get a logistics game going, or how it should feel anyway. That's kind of how I felt. Jamie, if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, as well as playing our classmates' games, just getting all those ideas. Sebastian was very insistent as our professor early on, with trying to expose us. Every other class, I want to say, we spent time playing games in class. It's sort of like reading books to become a better writer. And since we've designed this game, playing other games that aren't even necessarily like Race to the Rhine in the same genre, I've learned a lot and found a lot of things that I want to steal and throw into our games or future games. This one I know Doc Sterrett and Mike Dunn had a lot of experience with, and this was one of the most interesting things, working with sponsors and working with different members of the wargaming and armed service community that Sebastian exposed us to via interviews or mid-semester check-ins, was knowing when to take advice and knowing when not to. This was hard for us to figure out, especially given that we have a sponsor, and honestly, all the advice our sponsors gave us was pretty awesome and spot on. But one of the things that came up every single time we gave a presentation on the game, every single time we ran the game, including up to CGSC with some of the students there, was the inclusion of medical supplies and medical supply routes. The give and take back and forth was something that everybody who had anything to do with logistics always said, hey, you have a really good system of push. You're pushing a lot of supplies, and that is really important. But what about pulling? What about the idea that, when soldiers are wounded, they have to be brought back on that same supply chain, sort of clouding it, as well as, pushing a medical supply to the front. That was probably our most given bit of feedback, and the one that we had to repeatedly not include, in addition to things like expanding air and naval, because it just wasn't within the scope of the game. That was something that Doc Sterrett, I think, told to us at one point after we really wrestled with it a lot, was it is a great idea and would make a great game, but at a certain point you have to scope your own game. And I think realizing that sooner would have been beneficial to us, but I think was a really valuable lesson. I don't know, Zach, if you want to touch on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, we tried to force the air superiority component for so long. And in hindsight, I do wish we shed it probably like 2-3 weeks sooner than we did. But whatever. No game design is perfect. We probably, as soon as we removed it, the game instantly, although it was something we wanted to work so badly, as soon as we got rid of it, we were like, wow, this game is way better, because suddenly you got rid of this giant aspect in the middle of the game that bogged it down and slowed it down. And I think players would have gotten bored with it if it was left in the game.
And then finally, going on that, accepting imperfection. One thing, if and I have some friends in Sebastian's class this time around, which I've already told them, but every game is an abstraction. Every playtest is going to break your game, and that's a good playtest, and you're eventually just going to have to ship it. So accepting imperfection, and then iterating in the future is something that was definitely learned the hard way. But sometimes you got to do it. And then finally, how the game has affected us sort of after CGSC. And then we will go into sort of a final round of questions, I believe. So Zach, if you want to talk about how the game has impacted you professionally and personally.
Yeah, I mean, I took this class. I actually took the class because I just wanted to stop reading books and long research papers and writing long papers. I was like, all right, I just want to take like a class that's different. I want to take at least one class that is just just different. And so this looked like a fun one. I was like, all right, I'll take this class. And then the first class, Sebastian was like, this class is hard. If you're not cut for it, like, you can just leave now. And I was like, oh God, maybe I should leave. But I stuck with it, and I'll say that I learned a lot, and it's gone on my resume since. And it's actually something that a lot of interviewers over the past like 4 or 5 months have been really fascinated by, really interested in. And I think it set me apart in a lot of ways, because I just don't think a lot of young people in our field do. So I feel lucky that I took that class, and it turned into something with a real sponsor and something like with a real deliverable that I can show off and talk about. Because I'm not a professional wargamer, and I'm not like excellent at it or anything. I'm very amateur at it, but I've done it once, so I feel confident I can do it again. And so in that way, it's helped out a lot.
Yeah, adding on to that, when we first came into Sebastian's class, not only did he say that it was going to be hard and that you should leave if you can't handle it, in a loving way, but he also said that he wanted to make it a thesis level course, but they wouldn't let him. So he's just going to give us a thesis level amount of work, and we're just going to have to deal with it, which was true, but in the best way. He also emphasized that we were going to get a lot out of it. It was going to be the best class we took at Georgetown, which I think is true. And something I've taken, I also am not a professional wargamer at the moment, but it has changed the way I think about teaching, mentoring, learning. The difference between analytical wargame, which is something I was familiar with before, and even a commercial wargame. The idea of being able to teach something through gaming is something that we saw firsthand. Obviously, the majors at CGSC, this is their job; they're professionals. But watching them learn, or at least contextualize what they were doing in the classroom through the game, is something that I absolutely have and plan on taking into the future with how I convey any messages. So it's the class I recommend to everybody at Georgetown, and it is something that even professionally, sort of with what I do, looking at the wargaming workforce has been both a passion and then some professional thing of mine. The lack of young wargamers and the drive for the community to change that is something that I think is vital, and I think everybody here probably is contributing to in a positive way. So that's us. Pending further questions, happy to chat. Also share contact information. But thank you all for letting us blab on about something we love for an hour and a half on your Tuesday nights when you could have been doing something better.
Well, everyone, just round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much for taking the time to come speak to us. I think we probably do have a few more questions. And while you're answering those, you can just drop your contact info in the chat if anyone wants to get in contact with them. But for me, my question would be, do you guys have any wargaming plans for the future? Are you going to, I know you work in diverse fields, do different things that are far removed from logistics. Is there a game that you maybe have in mind or kicking around, or one that's relevant to the work you do on a day-to-day basis that you're thinking about?
Zach, I don't know if you want to take this first, but I feel like we could make out a game out of all the different design suggestions we got and denied. The whole time we were making the game, so I think there's also a lot more we could do with this game. I have a notepad full of things from our CGSC playtest that would make this game a lot better. I'm excited to, hopefully Sebastian liked what we did too, and he asked us to help out some people in his cohort this year. I know CGSC, I believe, is running another Basics of Wargaming Sebastian sponsor program. So helping that group as much as they can. But if Doc Starrett and Mike Dunn ever invite us back out to play Root and Hanabi at the kitchen table, we'll answer the call happily.
Yeah, it's I'll just say, it's something that I wouldn't shy away from if wherever I'm working, somebody wants to design a war game. If it's a subject or topic that I'm really intrigued in, I'll probably volunteer to help out with it. I had fun designing this game. It was hard, but I had fun. And so I feel confident that I can do it. And I kind of mentioned that earlier, but I guess the point is it's just something that I feel like I have in the toolbox now. In that way, something I can do. It's something I'd be glad to do, given an interesting topic. And I'm sure it's not the last of wargaming I'll see.
I personally have one last question for you guys before I don't see any more in the chat, but you guys mentioned several times throughout your presentation that there were certain mechanics that you felt just made for boring gameplay that you had to change, stuff like dropping into Oslo on the first turn, things like that. How did you balance making things educational versus creating a fun game, creating an interesting scenario that keeps players engaged and allow them to reach that educational outcome?
One thing that our group agreed on day one, which I think was really helpful and something that I know we came back to a few times, was people aren't going to learn if they're not having fun. that as sort of a central part of our game. Like, we were the group that was doing the work with the sponsor, which ended up being a blessing. But it at first didn't seem like it was going to be as fun as Banana Wars, which was also a very fun game. But we knew that no one was going to play it and learn anything if it wasn't also fun. And something can be educational, but also, be enjoyable to play. And one of the nicest things that the students at CGSC said is, the one thing that they all said was that they had a lot of fun playing and that they were excited to come to class to do it. And then listening to the after action review, the things they were talking about sustaining potential combat power and all those learning objectives that, 8 months before we'd been told by Doc Starrett and Todd and Mike Dunn we were aiming for. That is one thing that I think we did a good job doing. How we did it, just reminding ourselves that if we're not having fun, no one else is going to. So occasionally that meant flying in the face of realism. I mean, Sweden and Finland are a great example of that. It made we until the very end didn't have a great answer for why are only part of Sweden and Finland in this game. Like, that doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. But we knew that based off playtesting and based off the fact that we had no fun the first few playthroughs, we needed to expand the map. We needed to add maneuver. We needed to make it a little bit more exciting. So, making sure that education is fun, I think was a huge part of just using that as a cornerstone. Was really vital to getting that end product we did, and hopefully meeting some of the objectives that we think we did.
Yeah, I'll just caveat off that one too, because that's kind of the theme for me. I know I also answered Dr. Starrett's question, which is like, what surprised me most, which is kind of similar to what Jamie said, is like, you think simplicity means it's easier, but like what surprised me most was like, John, between Jamie, John, and I feel like we had a million big ideas. We had, like, every time we sat down together and played, we were generating tons of ideas, and we were like, so there's so much we can do. And when we put the idea down, we finally like implemented it. It was like so complex and so clunky, and we're just like, crap, like, how do we make this, as Jamie said, how do we make this fun? Like, this, the way it is right now, it's not really fun. It's a cool idea. It may be realistic, but we need to make it simpler. We need to make it more fun. And what surprised me is that just because you're driving towards simplicity from complexity is like, it's hard to do. And sometimes you have to cut out things that you really like while you're doing it.
All right. Well, if we have no other questions, we'll just go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We hope to see you at a future Goose webinar. We have several planned throughout the late summer and fall. So please keep an eye out on that. And without that, we're gonna stop right now.